is a dramatic example of the unpredictable results of man's tampering with the environment. Residential patterns within the catchment are also changing. Quiet country towns like Beaconsfield Upper have a minimal impact on the environment if they are limited in size and not allowed to become large urban centres. The population in the catchment has grown from about 40,000 people to 65,000 in less than 10 years. Towns like Pakenham have become fringe areas for the growth of Melbourne. The land here is relatively cheap, but within commuting distance of the city. Agricultural land is being converted to other uses. The demand for land also intrudes into the bush. The clearing of trees and undergrowth not only alters the character of the landscape, but reduces the land's capacity for water retardation and opens the way for the intrusion of exotic weeds like blackberries. There is also competition for land in these hills for another purpose. At present, quarrying is not permitted here, but if zoning was altered, this whole hillside could disappear. It contains 77 million tonnes of high-grade stone suitable for road surfaces. In the Lang Lang area are several sand quarries, and more could be established when the concrete sand supplies near Melbourne are used up. The quarries here are attractive propositions because of their size, richness, and their closeness to Melbourne and the availability of rail transport to move the sand to markets. One of the largest quarries is operated by Australian Consolidated Industries. This company has worked these high-grade sand deposits since 1952 and currently produce 200,000 tonnes of glass sand a year. It is the major source of glass sand in Victoria, and the estimated life of the deposit is at least 50 years. Since 1962, extraction of sand has been by a dredge process capable of cutting to 6 metres below the waterline of the dredge pond. The site is significant because of the quality of the sand and the long life of the reserves. The site is served by rail and there is ready access to the company's processing plants in Melbourne. Quarries need not permanently ruin the landscape. ACI has undertaken an extensive program to restore the original vegetation to the mined-out areas. John Ulst, the production manager, and Narina Dupree's a botanist from the Lands Department who supervises the rehabilitation work, showed me what they are doing. And I understand, John, that for each tonne of sand which is mined, that a certain allocation of funds is made for rehabilitation works which Narina supervises.
That's right. We're looking at around about 20 to 25 cents a tonne that we mine out to be used on our rehabilitation program. From this position you can see a fairly wide range of the spectrum as we're operating on it. The biological reservoirs, the undisturbed brush, and also the mined out dune areas that we have mined over in the past. You can see where the overburden has been spread over the dunes. Some of it's been brushed with tea tree and various heaths, and we've experimented with some gum trees there. You can see where the fresh topsoil is currently being spread on the old dunes, and some of the old dune systems still to be worked on the area.
And you're in charge of those works, and what does that actually involve?
Well, what we're basically aiming to do is to re-establish the natural vegetation as closely as possible. Before we could start any of that, we undertook a complete and thorough botanical survey of the area, as well as the mammals and birds at the same time. Well, this is basically where the rehabilitation starts, on top of the mining face. The topsoil is pushed off into a mound down there, somewhere where it's accessible to the tractors and to the loading equipment. It's reloaded into a truck and moved over onto areas which are being reclaimed. And from there it's just respread, trying to approximate the same thickness or the same variation of depth that it occurs naturally. Before the topsoil is actually moved, we come through and remove the trees and all the vegetation and cart that over onto areas which have been covered with topsoil, and then that is used as a brush matting, and that supplies seed if you cut the brush, which we try to do as much as possible when it's in seed, as well as acting as a surface mulch, protective mulch for developing seedlings. And as a result of that, about a third of the area has been set aside as biological reserves, which we can use for plant material to help in the restoration, in the rehabilitation.
And no mining occurs in those areas there?
No mining is to take place in those areas. They're purely as a reserve.
Right.
After that, we can then go along and plant plants that have been raised in the nursery, which we have on the site. The nursery is used to grow plants which are not regenerating naturally from the topsoil.
Oh, yes.
And as time goes on, we'll get a better idea of what will come back and what won't.
I would imagine that in the process that you will be creating significant wetlands.
Yes, there will be a lot more water expanse than there is now. Although there are perched water tables with quite a variety of different swamp types around,
Yes.
there's going to be a lot more, and we'll be trying to recreate as much diversity in that as possible.
These pelicans on the Turidan Inlet, so tame that they can be fed by hand, are an example of the natural attractions that draw people to the bay. But conflicts can arise between the interest of people who settle here as permanent residents, those who maintain holiday homes, and those who come here as day trippers. Bruce McCallum, a resident of Summers, which is a popular coastal resort, told me about some of these conflicting pressures. I imagine you've seen some considerable changes in that time.
Oh, there've been many changes, mainly in the numbers of people coming down and using Summers. In about that time, we've seen an increase in permanent residents, people staying here full-time, from about 200 to about 400, with, of course, the building that goes along with that, and an increase in the number of holiday makers, up to about 2,000 to 2,500 in the peak holiday time.
These holiday makers, they have their own home or they're camping?
The majority have their own home. There is a caravan park locally, which is very well attended. In fact, it's booked out virtually all year round.
Bruce, are there any disagreements between the permanent residents and the holiday homeowners?
Yes, there are, Grant, and the major one being that of drainage. The permanent residents are in a very good position, that is, they're here for the whole year, to be able to see the major physical problems of the Summers area. The holiday makers, on the other hand, are here for the prime time of the year, that is the summer period,
yes,
when stormwater is not a major problem. The drainage of Summers is poor, and the permanent residents feel that a proper drainage system is necessary. There are added problems with the day trippers, added to the holiday makers with homes here, the caravan park holiday makers, and also the permanent residents. This puts very much pressure on the beach facilities of the Summers area.
No doubt these pressures will increase in the years to come. Have you any ideas how they could be resolved?
Well, as Summers is a popular resort, and the pressure is centred on Summers, and there are large areas of beach as yet hardly used, perhaps greater access could be given to those areas across the foreshore, perhaps to take the day trippers away from the Summers area, or stabilise the visitations to Summers.
Have to be careful of the environmental problems that could occur out in new areas.
For sure.
The most controversial development at Westernport is the industrial complex near the town of Hastings. The SOBHP fractionation plant is the sole receiving and distributing point for crude oil and liquid petroleum gas which comes by pipeline from the oil fields in Bass Strait. On this 100-hectare site, 450,000 barrels of crude oil are handled daily. This represents about 95% of Australia's total production. Nearby there is a steelworks operated by John Lysarts. A hot strip mill and cold reduction mill produce steel sheets and coils from slabs of steel supplied from Port Kembla in New South Wales. The Hastings site is attractive to industry because it is close not only to Melbourne but also to the state's major energy supplies of oil and brown coal. The SOBHP complex is not a refinery, but a fractionation plant and redistribution point. Oil and liquid petroleum gas are redirected to refineries, shipped interstate or exported overseas. 50,000 barrels of propane and butane a day are exported, mostly to Japan. The existence of a sheltered deep-water harbour, which can handle vessels up to 100,000 tonnes with only minor dredging, is another of the main reasons for the siting of the industrial complex here. But what is the effect of this sort of development on the sensitive ecology of the bay? Robert Hayes, a local conservationist, has some very definite views. Robert, what's important about this area?
The mangrove salt marsh complex running out into the mudflats provides a breeding ground for many of the fish that are fished commercially and caught recreationally. From the point of view of wildlife, particularly the wading birds, royal spoonbills, pelicans and birds like the ibis, the mudflats are very important as a feeding ground, and also in this top end of the bay as a rookery. The area is quite large and there are significant populations of birds here which are conceivably threatened by development and changes in the ecology of the bay. The interrelationship here is not well studied and it's not well known as such, how they affect each other and the various influences of the high and low water marks, the bird life, the mangroves, the salt marsh behind the mangroves and the drainage patterns draining into the salt marsh mangrove complex. But very much more important, more significant from an ecological point of view is the reclamation area around us. It basically allows filling in of the mangrove, the salt marsh and the foreshore vegetation generally. It's a complete and utter total blot out of the vegetation for that whole area and has tremendous impact, or could have tremendous impact upon the ecology of the bay.
However, Robert, given this rare combination of natural deep water channels and the flat hinterland, which undoubtedly are of national and state importance, and the employment opportunities which might result from any development here, would you be opposed to any further industrial development in this area?
There is potential here for development, but I don't think it has to be of the what I see as very destructive and environmentally damaging type that the government is planning for down here.
Bitter battles have been fought over the extent and type of development that should be allowed. If industries are to be established, what type should they be? What we must remember is that any change will affect the living and non-living components, particularly in the local environment around Hastings. We must also realise that this local environment is but one part of the total Western Port ecosystem. As with the catchment as a whole, so must a balance be struck between the use of the resources here and the conservation of the bay's natural environment.